Our next speaker is George Mürer, who works on evolving repertoires in Kurdistan, Iran, Greater Khorasan, and the Indian Ocean region. His dissertation in the CUNY Graduate Center in 2020 concerns spheres of Balak cultural performance and patronage in Oman, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait. He also researches professional circuits of contemporary Kurdish wedding musicians, several of whom he manages in the context of international appearances. Central to his work are intersections across geographic and ethno-linguistic boundaries in the intertwining of contemporary popular culture, mediascapes, and political orientations with notions of heritage, identity, and tradition. Recent publications include a co-edited special themed issue of The World of Music, New Contours in Kurdish Music Research, and a chapter in Music in Arabia, Perspectives on Heritage, Mobility, and Nation, edited by Virginia Danielson, Isa Volos, and Ann K. Rasmussen. He makes ethnographic documentaries, and I can attest that they're really fine documentaries, and I'm hoping he gets a chance to screen them at some point, and has been teaching at Hunter College, Brooklyn College, and Columbia University. Please welcome George Mürer.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I want to thank Professor Felez for organizing the symposium and the Center for Jazz Studies as well, and all my colleagues who are presenting. I'm very honored to be here. What is unique about the concept fusion? It does sound deliberate, scientifically executed, and intended to produce a massive and perhaps uncontrollable amount of energy, or perhaps it is the fusing together of two substances that don't naturally adhere. I suggest that fusion as a term implies the act of fusing is an act of deviance from a prescribed social order of non-conforming. I don't insist on this interpretation, but if fusion merely referred to combining material from different sources, what musical corner would not fall under that umbrella? In the history of fusion as an offshoot of jazz that refused to remain aloof from electrified rock and funk, the process of fusion may itself be a narrative forged through detached perceptions and then imposed on otherwise seamless and organic trajectories embarked upon by loose configurations of creative collaborators. In drawing some parallels between fusion in the sense that emerged in the late 60s and early 70s and musical milieus I have been researching in the Arab Gulf states, specifically Kuwait and Oman, in the context of this paper, I'm thinking especially about the intertwining of musical connoisseurship with transgressions of tacitly observed boundaries that have social and often racial implications. In the formal pedagogical programs designed by official Kuwaiti institutions, a Kuwaiti musical identity unproblematically oscillates between a hybrid maritime Bedouin heritage, a modern and classically imbued pan-Arab sphere of belonging, and the prestige of conversance in European haute couture, exemplified by the musical sensibilities enshrined in the so-called Western classical canon. One of the most vibrant musical corners of cosmopolitan Kuwait City is a circuit of private and relatively informal performance settings where musicians and music aficionados converge around the twin genres of Adani and Yemeni. The foundations for both being vintage repertoires cultivated in the port cities of coastal Yemen, notably Mukalla in Hadramaut, which became popular among Kuwaiti listeners in the 70s and 80s. The main distinction is that Adani songs are more elegant, subdued, sentimental, and appropriate for small, intimate gatherings, while Yemeni songs are marked by much more dramatic, percussive flourishes and have the power to whip young Kuwaiti men into a frenzy at large nighttime samrah gatherings. The Adani and Yemeni circuit is a voluminous space in which to deviate from the Mashreki, that is to say, Egyptian and Levantine maqam frameworks and tarab orthodoxies in which successive generations of Kuwaiti musicians are well versed, and to claim an alternative to state narratives of Kuwaiti cultural heritage that sometimes approach pageantry when removed from the intimate context maintained by seafaring lineages who have directly inherited the music of pearlers and nahams, those who lead songs performed by sailors laboring on ships. It is a space in which to engage fluidly with another perspective on the seascape that has shaped Kuwaiti society, the linkages to more distant shores, notably South Arabia and India. Yemen, particularly coastal regions, Tehama, Aden, and Hadramaut, evinces a long history of engagement with Hindi film music alongside other popular musics in global circulation like rumba and Cairene Ornia. The Hadrami singer Ali al-Khambashi, himself of Somali heritage, is famous for engaging overtly with Indian film music, as this instrumental opening to his song Habaytak Habibi illustrates. Among his 1970s recordings that were distributed in Kuwait by the label Ramco is an Arabic language rendition of popular Indian singer Muhammad Rafi's song Raha Gardishan Mein Hardam Mere Ishq Sitara from the 1966 Indian film Dubadan. This is the original.
रहा गर्दिशों में हरदम मेरे इश्क का सितारा रहा गर्दिशों में हरदम.
Using the same melody, Ali al-Khambashi recorded Ayha al-Galb al-Muhatam, which remains a staple of the Adni Yamani repertoire to this day. In 1989, a pioneering Kuwaiti interpreter of Hadrami popular music, Yusuf al-Mutrif, performed this song with the then Kuwait-based Pakistani singer and harmonium player Moeen and tabla player Ghulam Hossein. Moeen actually sings the original Muhammad Rafi song at the beginning, but the piece nonetheless was circulated informally as Ayha al-Galb al-Muhatam.
रहा गर्दिशों में हरदम मेरे इश्क का सितारा.
This version, recorded at a jalsa or private lively musical gathering more than 20 years later in 2013 by an Egyptian soundman who sells recordings he makes off the board at events to eager listeners, would be classified as being in the Yemeni vein and is performed by the late Yusuf al-Mutrif's son, Mutrif al-Mutrif, who sings and plays oud with an assemblage of musicians. In the opening, he seems to be channeling his father and Moeen's famous recording, but also taking liberties. I asked him which South Asian musicians he listens to for inspiration, and he listed 3 of the most world-famous Qawwali singers. And here we can hear it in the verse, which confusingly also draws on another Ali al-Khambashi recording, Shalika la Shalika. an eruption of interlocking clapping and the use of vocal ornamentation meant to sound Indian in style. So you will hear in particular notes, and there's a sort of flourishes that are emulating Indian singing style. The solo spotlight for an instrumentalist at these performances is called fasl, essentially denoting an interlude. Listening to Mutter fa Mutter's oud solo here is a good example of the space for eclecticism carved out at these performances and the intensity associated with the Yamani genre. By contrast, the violin fasl for a song originally by the famous Hadrami singer and instrumentalist Muhammad Jumar Khan, himself of partial Punjabi heritage, that I filmed at a much smaller Adani gathering in the company of the same Egyptian soundman, has a much more refined character while engaging very explicitly with what is understood to be an Indian coloring, or Laun Hindi. It is important to note the social gulf that generally exists between Kuwaiti citizens and Indian, Bengali, Pakistani, Ethiopian, Yemeni, and Egyptian non-citizen guest laborers. Contact with India over history is part of the lore in which the so-called sea musics are enshrined, but the incorporation of South Asian musicians, mainly from Pakistan, as well as Hadramis into these circles defies the logic of, without really challenging, the customary social delineations established by the kafala system of sponsored labor that is notoriously exploitative and dehumanizing. The long-standing presence of Baloch communities in the Arab Gulf states also complicates to a far greater degree otherwise conspicuous distinctions maintained between citizens and non-citizens and between Arabs, Indians, South Asians, and Africans. Balochistan is a vast region that spans parts of Iran and Pakistan and extends into Afghanistan, and whose coastline faces the Arabian Peninsula across the Gulf of Makran, accounting for continuous migration over the centuries. The large ensembles that perform at Baloch weddings in Muscat notably resonate with the concept of fusion in the ways they celebrate the intertwining of different geocultural orientations, Baloch, Persian, Peninsular Arab, East African, and South Asian, with plentiful overtures to rock, funk, reggae, and Latin big band styles. One of the now legendary large Baloch bands of the early 20th century was Los Baluchos, who have spawned many imitators. In keeping with my opening reflections on the concept fusion, the significance I attach to the melding of different musical idioms in the music that Baloch wedding bands play proceeds from their disregard for expectations that Baloch cultural performances adhere to Baloch repertoires and aesthetics. The musics that are folded together in these settings reflect the history and demonstrable positionality of these communities. The diversity of Baloch community settings in Oman, and this is the Baloch wedding bands, and here we can see images of more traditional Baloch culture being performed in the Gulf. The diversity of Baloch community settings in Oman is reflected in the range of musical styles that preside at weddings. Some resident ensembles are very representative of the music of the Liari section of Karachi. At other weddings, contemporary singers are brought over from Turbat, a large city in Makran in eastern, that is Pakistani-controlled Balochistan. In Batna, there are hereditary musicians whose forebears have been in Oman many generations and who sing and play drums and bagpipes, accompanying men's dances that hail from the Baloch-populated regions of eastern Hormozgan province in Iran, the vicinity of Jashk and Sirik. I have noted at such weddings, however, women will simultaneously assemble and celebrate in enclosed tents, dancing to the recordings of modern Baloch bands who are based in Muscat. The contexts of the modern bands are marked by age and gender. Comprised of young men, these bands inspire loyal followings among young Baloch males. However, there is a widespread perception that it is women who want to dance, and that is the reason such groups are necessary. The following example is assembled from a performance given by an all-male ensemble, the Mona Band, led by singer Alash, at an enclosed women's henna party, or henna bandan, which is part of a sequence of wedding festivities that takes several days. The party was in Wadi Hatat, one of the neighborhoods that has been recently constructed to meet the demands of Muscat's swelling population. Muscat is a coastal city and naturally spreads along the coastline, but also inland. Wadi Hatat and Amrat are built on the inland side of the small, steep mountain Jebel Matrah, and I've been told that the land they sit on is a floodplain with considerable risks posed to the inhabitants in the event of extreme weather. At the behest of the band, my friend Salman and I were allowed to attend the wedding party with the understanding that we took no photos or video and averted our gaze, but I was allowed to record the performance with my phone. It was in the spacious courtyard of a home that had been draped with colorful, gold-embroidered fabric and inlaid with mirrors. The prominent colors were red, green, and a deep, vibrant yellow. The women, I noted peripherally, were attired in the dresses of the same colors and threaded with glittering ornamental stitching. The children and men of the household freely entered the space but did not participate to the same extent in the celebration, which consisted of sitting on the ground facing the musicians and dancing as one pleased. Young men, adolescents and a bit older, were present as well, but outside the walls, clustered at the openings in positions where they could not see in but could hear. They weren't dressed up a bit, wearing flip-flops and t-shirts and running pants. The band themselves tend to wear chic streetwear while performing. The band, who I'd seen a number of times, consisted of a drum kit and a wide array of percussion instruments, from congas to frame drums to tablas and dolaks, and bass guitar, electric guitar, and keyboards. After they set up with each musician testing the sound levels and tuning, the music commenced on a slightly unexpected note. A young boy was handed the mic and sang a brief passage. After reverently making space for this performance, the band led off with a more polished arrangement in which I could instantly hear the influence of both Pink Floyd, who I know to be a beloved of the guitar player Al-Badi in particular, and contemporary Indian pop and film music. As much as the vocalization is informed by an Indian aesthetic, the lyrics are in Arabic. This was followed by a 45-minute segment sung in a Mashkati dialect of Baluch. It is extremely upbeat and chipper in tone with densely propulsive percussion, but veered several times into an interlude sonically marked and verbally announced as Lewa, a ceremonial dance complex linked in name and corresponding traditions to Bantu cultures in the vicinity of the Swahili zone of East Africa. Lewa is a circle dance accompanied by a variety of percussion instruments and also by a large conical sham called zumari in Swahili and clearly related to the Egyptian mizmar and the Persian surnai, which the keyboard part we heard was meant to approximate. There are numerous dances in the Swahili zone that use this instrument, such as the msewe, and here we can see a celebratory dance in Matadoni in the Lamu archipelago in Kenya, where the instrument is used and the melodic character is quite similar to the motifs ubiquitously preserved in Lewa performances in the Gulf region. I use this example because the dress, the dance formation, and particularly the swords all resonate with Omani traditional culture, a clear residue of the history of Omani rule that had exerted a particularly lasting influence on the culture of the Lamu and Zanzibar archipelagos, as well as on Mombasa. Lewa in the Gulf has come to refer to a suite of ceremonial dance idioms whose names, such as Katamiri and Sudani, index different regional and ritual affiliations and unambiguously signals a consciousness of African ancestry against the backdrop of large-scale manumission pursuant to the abolition of slavery in the Indian Ocean region. Yet, in Makran, Oman, UAE, and Karachi, it also has a strong Baluch connotation, as it is associated with Baluch-speaking communities and performers of East African heritage. More recently, Sinti keyboard parts have been designed as stand-ins for the Zumari, and rather than preserve the intonation and dragging melodic motifs, a new set of intoxicating sounding riffs have become recognizable as posited under the rubric of Lewa. This stems from pop reimaginings of Lewa produced in Karachi and Muscat that are presented in music videos where Lewa dancers are shown with face paint and caricatures of traditional African costume modeled after the stage attire of Sidi communities of African heritage in India have been encouraged to wear at cultural performances. Both of these examples have been meant to illustrate the forging of new idioms necessitated by the discomfort of individuals with a static cultural identity amid multiple spheres of social belonging and contact. While this has changed today with the impact of a pan-Arab cultural sphere and the embrace of Western notions of music and global popular music flows for long periods in the Gulf, ceremonial and festive arts involving singing, drumming, wind and string instruments, and choreographed body motion were considered the domain of people of African heritage, while Baluch and Hadrami identities were intertwined in many frames with Africanness or blackness. Today, Kuwaiti and Mashkati Baluch cultural spheres are constantly reinventing themselves, drawing on relevant pasts and imagined futures, elevating the realms of youth culture and cross-cultural interface to the newly enshrined perches reserved for conservatory-bred artistry and authenticated tradition. I should point out that there are plentiful bona fide jazz rock fusion groups in the Gulf, notably in UAE and Bahrain, but obviously I was directing my focus in a slightly different direction. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, there was a lot to digest there. But one thing you said towards the end about the addition of keyboards and sort of snapping to essentially what Western ideas about pitch and intonation kind of struck me, and I'm just kind of curious whether is there pushback about that? Is it considered like a real no-no? How is that playing out in the culture?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, I wouldn't think it was so much a Western thing. I would associate it more with global popular music and also technological flows. I mean, it's not just the use of the instrument, and yes, the intonation, unless it's programmed to specifically, make use of certain intervals, which it certainly is in many parts of the world. It's really the sound of it. So the idea is that you could, many artists around the world, performers, have like keyboards that perfectly emulate the tone of that same instrument, the zorna, like in Kurdish context and so forth, but they will interchange it with more like futuristic aesthetics. In these contexts, the keyboard does tend to have either a very pop-oriented or a very futuristic aesthetic, especially with the lewa section where it has like an envelope-y, there was kind of a shrill, tone-bendy sound, and it uses a scale that sort of roughly is suggestive of scales like Hijaz, like certain tetrachords that are kind of stereotypically and cinematically associated with like Arabian culture. And I think that as this was something that particularly emerged in Karachi, it was sort of like pointing to the Arabianness of the lewa as it is performed in Karachi, but then with the understanding and a lot of the pageantry. If I had more time, I would have showed like videos of how people dress up, and both in actual live performances and in music videos, where they have feathers and body paint and like loincloths and so forth, and there's sort of palm fronds, like clothing made of palm fronds that are sort of based on cinematic caricatures of actually West African culture that have people in India of African descent have been encouraged to wear to play up their sort of Africanness in like these sort of festival contexts, and this has been absorbed by sort of Afro-Baluch communities in Karachi and then kind of represented in Muscat. But like back to the keyboard, I think there's this kind of like fluid melding of like Baluch sort of peninsular Omani, kind of like some of the percussion elements are related to sort of peninsular Omani wedding festivities and other festive occasions that involve drumming. And then like sort of, like the sort of futuristic sounds that, draw on kind of, EDM and hip hop and all kinds of things that kind of like, it's like a very broad, wide open sort of soundscape, large band from it.
Well, it made me think of, actually, in line with Mark's talk, of this translation, right? And to paraphrase George Lewis, who's translating who, right? And I was wondering that if you could speak more to, the ways in which, I guess, that South Asian music circulates with these communities, and how the musicians pick up, and if their audiences know this music as originating from South Asian film music or whatever, or if the audiences are completely sort of ignorant of that and just consuming it as Arabic music.
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I thought in Mark's talk, I think the using the terms emergent kinships and disruptive kinship made a lot of sense in those contexts, and I could have very easily used those terms as well in respect to the sort of, both in terms of how people come together and participate in sort of musical collectives in the case of the Kuwaiti circles, and also in terms of what the Baluch bands who have kind of a shared heritage, but kind of agree to draw upon a very widely diverse pool of source material. And it's a fact that, sort of Bollywood music, Bollywood films, a lot of Indian popular music, pop music from India and in some cases from neighboring regions of South Asia, does circulate incredibly widely. It's very popular and is woven into Egyptian music and Algerian Rai, and in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and in Russia it's hugely popular. And in West Africa as well. I have a colleague who works on the consumption of Hindi film music in Ghana, for instance. And in this case, I think what was significant was the fact that they were looking at the Hindi film music through the lens of coastal Yemeni musicians, and the way they engaged with it in prior decades, in the 1960s mainly. And sort of, because I didn't get to talk about this at great length, but the way musicians are tend to be trained in Kuwait is that there are institutes of higher musical arts that emphasize kind of Cairene style of Arab music. So the music that we played in Egypt and Syria, and then like sort of a common practice, European common practice, approaches to violin. So there's a lot of training in that. So it's like a real divergence from that to like go to this cassette culture that came from Yemen and basically put on a pedestal a lot of these Hadrami Yemeni musicians who would not be taken all that seriously in like the tastes of that are sort of Cairene, that might be more privileging of like Kulthum and Muhammad Abdul Wahab and Said Darwish and all this. So but then the way the music itself circulates, like people, there's a kind of a culture of record collecting and things like that, and there's these Kuwaiti cassette labels that acquired all of this Hadrami and Hijazi music when they were founded in like very early 1970s. But a lot of what people are engaging with, which is what I was trying to point out when I mentioned Mutraf mentioning these like globally famous Qawwali singers like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and others, they don't really necessarily have to go very far to get a sense of the musicality that they want to bring into play. Like I haven't yet to encounter connoisseurs of like sarod players and like certain schools of classical raga performance, although they're these resident musicians. Like currently probably the most high profile one, his name is Arshid, he's from Pakistan and he's a Bansuri flute player, and he is all of these jalsat playing with them. If I had more time I would have shown examples of him, and he speaks fluent Arabic, but he's a guest laborer. I mean, all of these musicians, they're not there as musicians, they're there as laborers, sponsored, non-citizens. The same goes for Moeen, who is singing there, and the same goes for Arshid, the Bansuri player. So when I try to approach him to spend time with him, he's usually very busy doing, working in like an auto repair shop or whatever. And then at certain nighttime salons, musical salons, that's when he's available, because that's whenever he has free time, he's there playing music. So the circulation is kind of fraught in that way. But there are certain Kuwaiti popular singers who release albums. I mean, this stuff is all circulated via Instagram and via like kind of bootleg recordings. But like there are people who release albums and music videos that are incredibly lavish, that are interpretations, like recreations of Bollywood, like completely extravagant, high budget productions with casts of thousands in costume and like holly powder flying everywhere. And so that like exists also. But what's interesting here is that these are very like engaged and kind of extemporaneously interactive spheres of musical performers and connoisseurs, rather than like creators of kind of mediated products per se.
All right, thank you.